The mist came off the moor before dawn, thick and grey, smelling of wet peat and cold stone. It curled around the chimneys of Esherton Hall and settled into the seams of the old walls, the way it had every autumn morning for 300 years. Inside the smell was different: beeswax and camphor, coal smoke, and the particular sourness of a sick room that has been shut too long. Ruth Calloway was the kind of woman a house forgot it employed. Not pretty enough to be remarked on, not clumsy enough to be dismissed, she moved through the corridors of Esherton with a basket on her arm and her eyes down, and most of the family had never learned her name. She was 23. She had one skill that mattered, and it was not sewing or dusting or laying a fire, though she did all three. She knew sickness. Her mother had been the woman the village sent for when the fever came, and Ruth had learned at her elbow before the fever took her mother too. The old Duke was dying. Everyone in the house said so, and had said so for a month, the way people say a thing so often it stops meaning anything. He would not last the week. He had not lasted 3 weeks of not lasting the week. The night nurses had given notice one by one, because he was foul-tempered, and because dying men are heavy work for wages that did not account for it. On the night this story begins, no one in Esherton Hall would sit with the Duke of Esherton, but a maid nobody had troubled to remember, subscribe to the channel, and stay for what she did next, because not one soul in that great cold house believed it would matter to anyone at all. Ruth had not been asked to sit with him. She had simply gone up, when Mrs. Pryor stood wringing her hands in the corridor with no one left to send, and said she would do it. She did not ask what it paid. She did not ask if it would be noticed. She had a basket of feverfew and willow bark already made up, because she had made it up 3 nights running out of habit, expecting no one would use it. The Duke's rooms were at the end of the west wing, where the wind came hardest off the moor. Ruth carried her basket and a bundle wrapped in a blue wool blanket, held against her shoulder the way a woman carries a thing she does not intend to put down. The bundle was a baby. His name was Thomas. He was not hers, not by blood that the law would recognise, though she had raised him from 4 weeks old, since her sister Alice died of the same fever that had taken their mother, and there was no one else living who would have him. She was not supposed to bring him into the house. The rules on that point were plain, and she had broken them plainly, every night for 2 months, because there was no one to leave him with after dark, and she would not leave him alone in the cold room above the stables where she slept. She kept him quiet. She kept him warm. She had never once been caught. Tonight she did not think about being caught. She thought about the old man in the bed, whose breath came thin and fast, whose hands on the counterpane looked like something carved rather than something living. She set Thomas down in a basket by the hearth, banked the fire high, and went to the bed with a cup of broth she had kept hot against her own body the whole way up the stairs. She did not know that someone was watching from the dark of the doorway. She did not know that he had come back to Esherton that very night, after 7 years away, unannounced, in a plain travelling coat with no crest on it, and that he had climbed the back stair on purpose so that no servant would see him and carry word ahead. He stood in the shadow past the threshold, where the candlelight did not reach, and he watched a maid he had never met kneel by his father's bed, and speak to a dying man, as if the dying man were still worth the trouble of kindness. She did not know that the man standing there was the old Duke's only son. She lifted the old man's head with one arm, the way her mother had taught her, so he would not choke on the broth, and she spoke low. Not the false cheerful patter some nurses used, but plain words, the kind you would say to any tired man at the end of a hard day. She told him the fire was good and hot. She told him the wind had turned, and it would rain by morning, and the roof did not leak in this room, whatever it did in the others. She told him nothing that flattered him, and nothing that lied to him, because she did not know how to do either. The old Duke's eyes, which had been half shut for 3 days, opened all the way. His breath rattled. His hand, when it moved toward her sleeve, and stopped short of touching it, as if he had forgotten he was allowed to touch another person without being asked first. From the basket by the hearth, Thomas woke and began to fuss, the small complaining sound of a baby who is warm and fed and simply wants to be looked at. Ruth set the cup down and went to him without hurry, lifted him, and settled him against her shoulder, patting his back in a rhythm so old and unthinking it was almost a heartbeat of its own. The old Duke turned his head on the pillow to see. He had not seen a child in that house in 11 years. He had not held one, had not been permitted the ordinary noise of one. Since his own son left it in anger, and his wife had gone into the ground the year after. He watched the maid sway with the baby, watched the small fist close on a fold of her collar, and something in his ruined chest gave way that had nothing to do with his lungs. He wept, not loudly, an old man's tears, silent, running down into the lines of a face that had forgotten how to make any other shape. Ruth did not see them at first, her back half turned, and when she did see them, she did not exclaim over it or call for anyone. She only came and sat on the edge of the bed, the baby still against her shoulder, and let him look as long as he wanted to look, and said nothing at all, because she understood, without being told, that some things are better witnessed than spoken to. In the doorway, the man in the plain coat did not move either. She did not know then that his name was Julian Vane, and that in his father's papers he was written down as the Marquess of Colford, heir to a dukedom he had sworn he would never come home to claim. She did not know that he had returned that night, meaning only to see his father's face once more before the end, and had found, instead, the first thing in 7 years that made him stand still. By morning the old Duke was no better, but he was no worse, and that alone was more than anyone in the house had managed to promise in a fortnight. Ruth carried her basket and her sleeping bundle down the back stair before the household woke, as she always did, and told no one what had passed in the night. Because in her accounting nothing remarkable had passed. She had sat with a sick man, she had fed him broth, her nephew had fussed, as babies do, and the old man had looked at him, as old men sometimes will. She did not think it worth mentioning that he had wept. She thought it worth keeping to herself, the way you keep a stranger's grief when you have been given no leave to share it. Mrs. Pryor found her in the linen room past noon, folding sheets with the particular tired precision of a woman who has not slept. The housekeeper was a broad, dry woman of 50, who ran Esherton Hall the way a good captain runs a ship in bad weather, without fuss and without much patience for nonsense. His Grace ate this morning, Mrs. Pryor said. First in a week. Ruth kept folding. Broth agreed with him. Broth has agreed with him every night this month and done nothing. Something else agreed with him last night. Mrs. Pryor watched her for a moment. You'll sit again tonight. It was not a question, and Ruth did not answer it as one. She only nodded and went on folding, because the sheets did not fold themselves, and there was no profit in discussing what could not be explained. What she did not know was that a coin had been left with Mrs. Pryor that morning, a full crown, with instructions that it be given to whichever maid had sat up with his Grace, and that the instructions had come not from the housekeeper's own goodwill, but from a man in a plain coat who had left the house again before the family woke, and who had given his name to no one but the coachman who drove him as far as the village inn. Mrs. Prior held the coin out to her that evening, before Ruth went up for the second night. Ruth looked at it a moment too long. "I didn't do it for money. No one said you did." "Then I'll not take it." She said it plainly, without heat, the way she said most things, and went on past the housekeeper toward the stair, her basket on her arm and Thomas already dozing against her shoulder under the blue blanket. Mrs. Prior stood with the crown still in her open palm, and something like surprise on her face, because in 30 years of service she had met a great many hands eager to close around a coin, and very few that closed instead around nothing at all, and walked on. She did not know that the coin would be offered again in a different form within the month, and that she would refuse that too, and that both refusals would be reported, faithfully and without her knowledge, to the man who had asked for them to be watched. The second night passed much as the first, though this time she did not need to be sent for. She simply went, because it had become, without either of them naming it so, her post. The old Duke was awake more of the night than asleep, and he watched her the way a man watches a fire he is not sure will hold till morning, careful not to trust it too soon. "You are not paid enough for this," he said, near midnight, his voice a dry scrape. "I'm not paid at all for it, your grace. I'm a linen maid." "Then why?" She considered the question honestly, the way she considered most things put to her. "Someone had to. That is not a reason, it's the only one I've got." She wrung a cloth and laid it cool across his brow. "You needn't thank me for it." "I'd have done the same for anyone." He was quiet a long moment, and when he spoke again his voice had gone rougher still. "I believe that you would." She did not know how much that sentence would come to matter, or to whom it would be repeated. She only smoothed the cloth and settled Thomas closer to the hearth, and let the fire and the wind off the moor fill the silence between them, the way silence had filled every night in that room before she came, only now it was a silence two people were keeping together instead of one man keeping alone. She thought, sometimes, in the quiet hours, that it was strange no member of the family had come near the sick room in all this time. She did not yet understand how large that strangeness was, or what it meant that the one member of the family who had come at night, unseen, and gone again before the sun was up, telling no one who he was. She only knew the old man was easier when she was there, and that seemed to her reason enough to keep coming back. The week that followed brought a change to Esherton Hall that no one below stairs could account for, though everyone remarked on it. Ruth's ration of coal, meant to warm the small room above the stables where she and Thomas slept, was doubled without explanation. A basket of good linen and 2 flannel gowns, small enough for an infant, appeared outside her door, with no card and no name attached. When the surgeon came from the village to look in on the old Duke, he was asked, quietly and by a steward none of the maids recognised, to look in on the child in the stable loft as well, and to send the account to the estate office rather than to the girl. Ruth thought it was Mrs. Prior's doing, some late kindness from a housekeeper who had softened toward her. She thanked Mrs. Prior for it once, and Mrs. Prior, who did not lie easily, only said that it was not her arranging, and left it there, because she had been asked, in a note delivered by hand and burned after reading, not to say whose arranging it was. Ruth did not press. She was not a woman who pressed at gifts. She used the coal, dressed the boy in the flannel, and went on sitting with the old Duke each night. and if she wondered at her sudden good fortune, she wondered privately, and did not let it slow her work. She did not know then that the man who arranged it had stood one more time in the shadow of that same doorway 3 nights after the first, to see for himself whether the kindness she had shown was a performance for an audience she had somehow guessed at, or whether it was simply what she was. She had not known he was there. She had spoken to his father exactly as she had the first night, plain and unflattering and warm, and had rocked the same fussing baby in the same unthinking rhythm, and he had gone away that third time with his answer, though he told no one what the question had been. The estate office at Esherton was a cold room even in summer, all dark oak and ledgers, and it was there that Ruth first spoke a full conversation with the man she knew only as Mr. Vane. She had been sent up with a tray, the under-footman being laid low with a chill, and found him at the desk with the household accounts spread before him, and a single candle burned nearly to the socket. He did not look like a duke's son to her, though she had no notion that was what he was. He looked like a man who worked too late and slept too little, his coat plain, his hands ink-stained, a scar through one eyebrow that gave his face a permanent faint scepticism. He was perhaps 30, though grief and work had put a decade's weight into the set of his shoulders. "Leave it," he said, without looking up, when she set the tray down. Then, seeming to hear his own rudeness, he did look up. "Forgive me. I've been at these figures since noon. They'll keep till morning, sir, figures generally do." He almost smiled. It changed his whole face for a moment, the way sun changes a grey field, there and then gone. "You're the one who sits with his grace. I am. He speaks better of you than of any physician who has attended him. That is not a small thing. He has never had a kind word for a physician in his life. He's not an easy patient." She said it without complaint, the way she might have observed that the weather was cold. "But he's not unkind. Only frightened, I think. Dying men mostly are, whatever face they put on it." He studied her for a long moment across the candlelight, the ledgers forgotten under his hand. "Most people who take that post do it for the wage. I've told his grace, and I'll tell you. I didn't do it for a wage. Then, for what?" The question came out flatter and more urgent than he had meant it to, and something crossed his face that looked, for an instant, like a man bracing for a lie he had heard too many times before. She did not give him one. "For nothing, sir. I don't say that to sound fine. I mean it plain. There was no one else to do it, and I know how, and a body oughtn't to die alone and cold if there's someone near enough to sit with him." She shifted, uncertain now under his scrutiny, and reached to take up the tray again as if to go. "I don't know why that wants explaining." "It doesn't," he said, quietly, and let her go. He sat a long while after she had gone, the candle guttering down to nothing, thinking of another room, another year, and a woman who had once knelt beside a suffering creature, only long enough to be seen kneeling, and had risen the moment the audience thinned. He had built a high wall against that memory, stone by stone, for 7 years. He did not tell Ruth Calloway that her plain, unpolished honesty had put the first crack in it. He only sat, and thought, and in the morning sent an order to the surgeon that whatever the child in the stable loft required, henceforth, the account was to come to him, and to no one else, and that his name was on no account to be given. The old Duke lived through that winter, when no one had expected him to live through the autumn, and the house began, cautiously, to speak of it as a kind of miracle, though it was not a miracle. It was broth kept hot against a woman's body on a cold stair, and willow bark steeped exactly right, and a voice that told him the truth instead of comfortable lies, and a small warm weight against a shoulder that reminded a lonely old man, one more time, what it was to be near something living that wanted nothing from him but his company. She did not know, through all of it, that the man in the plain coat who watched the ledgers by candlelight was, by every law of England, already the Duke of Esherton in waiting, and that everything soft that had come to her that winter, the coal, the linen, the surgeon's silent visits, had come from his hand, and no one else's. Given the way he gave everything that mattered to him, without his name attached, and without asking to be thanked. Lady Miriam Vane arrived at Esherton in the first week of March, in a carriage too fine for the muddy roads, with 3 trunks and a lady's maid, and an opinion on every subject that had not yet been asked for. She was the old Duke's younger sister, and Julian's aunt, a handsome, hard-eyed woman of 49, who had spent the winter in Bath being told, by everyone whose opinion she valued, that her brother could not last much longer, and that someone of sense ought to be at Esherton to see the household properly managed, before the whole estate fell into disorder. She did not know her nephew had already been managing it, quietly, for months. She assumed, on arriving, that the improvements she found, the well-kept accounts, the warm rooms, the doctor's regular visits, were her own doing simply by virtue of having decided to come. She took to giving orders within the hour of her arrival, and one of her first orders concerned a maid she saw crossing the east lawn with a baby on her hip. What, she said to Mrs. Pryor, in a voice pitched to Carrie, is that? That is Ruth Calloway, my lady, and her sister's boy. A servant with a child kept in this house. Lady Miriam's laugh arrived on cue, 3 practised beats, bright and empty as a struck bell. Whose is it, do we imagine? Not her husband's, I think, unless she has one hidden somewhere in the linen press. The child's mother is dead, my lady. Ruth has raised him since. How touching. And how convenient a story. She watched Ruth cross the lawn with the same flat, assessing look she might have given a horse she did not intend to buy. I will not have my brother's house made a haven for every fallen girl in the county and her byblow. See her dismissed by the week's end. Mrs. Pryor, who had buried 2 husbands and outlasted worse tempers than Lady Miriam's, did not so much as blink. His Grace values her particularly, my lady. His Grace is dying, and has not been fit to value anything for a 12-month. I am here now, and I will not have it said that Esherton keeps a nursery of sin under its own roof. She swept past without waiting for an answer, the way she swept past most obstacles, certain that her word alone would settle it. The word reached Ruth that same evening, second-hand and unkind, through a footman who thought it a fine joke. She heard it standing in the scullery passage with Thomas asleep against her shoulder, and she did not cry, because she had trained herself long ago not to cry where it showed, not since her mother died and there had been no one left to cry in front of, who would not think the less of her for it. She only went very still, and her hand, resting on the baby's back, did not shake, though it wanted to. She was sent for the next morning, to the small parlour where Lady Miriam had taken to receiving the household, as though she were already its mistress. The rooms smelled of hothouse flowers, forced into bloom out of season, sweet and slightly wrong. "You are the girl with the child," Lady Miriam said, not rising, not offering a chair. "I am, my lady. Whose is he?" "My sister's." "She's dead. I've raised him since he was 4 weeks old." How affecting. The laugh again, 3 beats, bright as struck brass. "And is it your habit to carry your sister's shame about the corridors of a duke's house, for the whole family to trip over?" Ruth felt the old Duke's words come back to her, unbidden. He had never had a kind word for a physician in his life, and yet he had one for her. She thought of that, and held to it, and answered in the same plain voice she had used on every hard thing that had ever been said to her. "There's no shame in him, my lady. He didn't ask to be born, and my sister didn't ask to die of it. I don't see that either of them did wrong, and I won't apologise for a child same as I wouldn't apologise for the weather." Lady Miriam's mouth thinned. "You will apologise for your insolence, or you will find another house to keep it in." "I'll not apologise for the truth, my lady. If it costs me the place, I'll go, and take him with me, and we'll manage as we've always managed. But I won't say a word against him to keep a roof, not for you nor anyone." For a moment neither woman spoke. Somewhere beyond the door, a clock struck the half-hour, thin and precise, and a coal shifted in the grate. Lady Miriam had expected tears, or grovelling, or at the very least a flinch, and had been given none of them, and something in her hardened further for not getting what she had come for. "You may go," she said at last. "I have not decided yet what is to be done with you." Ruth curtsied, because manners cost nothing, and she had been raised to them regardless of what they cost her pride, and went out with her chin level and her hands steady, and did not let herself shake until she was 3 corridors away and quite alone. She did not know that a man standing just inside the library, whose door stood a hand's width open onto that same passage, had heard every word of it, and that his jaw had gone tight enough to ache, and that he had needed the whole of his considerable self-command not to walk into that parlour and end the conversation himself. He did not do it. He had reasons of his own, old and complicated, for keeping his name out of that room a while longer. But he went that same hour to Mrs. Pryor, and gave an order in a voice the housekeeper had not heard him use before, quiet and absolute, that Ruth Calloway was to keep her post. On his authority, whatever any other member of the family might say to the contrary, and that if Lady Miriam pressed the matter she was to be told, plainly, that the estate's affairs, while his Grace lived, were managed by his heir, and by no one else. He did not go to Ruth himself to tell her so. He told himself it was not yet the time. In the quiet part of his mind he did not examine too closely. He knew the truer reason was that he did not yet trust himself to stand in front of her and say nothing more than an employer ought to say. Word of Lady Miriam's threat spread through the servants' hall the way such things always spread, faster and uglier with each telling, until by the second day it was said that Ruth Calloway had been caught in some disgrace with a gentleman of the house, and that the child was proof of it, and that she would be turned out within the week, whatever anyone above stairs decided. None of it was true. All of it reached her. She bore it the way she bore most things, without answering, without weeping where anyone could see, going about her work with her face set and her hands steady, because she had learned early that dignity was the one thing poverty could not take from her if she declined to hand it over. But at night, alone in the little room above the stables with Thomas asleep in the basket by her narrow bed, she allowed herself, finally, to feel the whole weight of it. She had nowhere else to go. She had no family left but the boy in the basket, no savings but a few shillings sewn into her hem, and no character reference she could ask for. Not now. Not with Lady Miriam's poison already working through the house like damp through a wall. If she was dismissed, she and Thomas would go on to the road with winter not yet done, and she knew, better than most, what became of women and infants on the roads of Cumberland in a hard march. She thought of the old Duke who needed her, and of the strange kindnesses that had come to her all winter from a hand she still believed was Mrs. Prior's, and of the man called Mr. Vane, whose good opinion had come to matter to her more than she was willing to name even to herself in the dark. She thought that whatever regard any of them held for her, it would not be proof against a duke's sister's will, not when weighed against a maid's word and a fatherless child. She resolved, that night, lying awake and listening to the wind worry at the shutters, that she would spare them all the trouble of deciding her fate for her. She would go before she was sent. She would not give Lady Miriam the satisfaction of a dismissal, and she would not put the old Duke, nor Mrs. Prior, nor the quiet grave man in the ledger-room, in the position of choosing between her and a member of the family. She would write a note in the morning, plain and short, and take the boy, and go. She did not know then that the very deed she meant as a dignified surrender would very nearly cost her everything she had already. Without knowing it, she wrote the note before first light, 3 lines only, thanking Mrs. Prior for her kindness, and asking that no trouble be made over her leaving, and left it on the kitchen table, where it would be found at the change of the watch. She wrapped Thomas in the blue blanket, took up the small bundle of her belongings, and went out the servants' door into a morning still black with night, meaning to be past the gates and on the road to the village before anyone in the house was properly awake. She did not see the old Duke again to say goodbye. She told herself that was mercy, not cowardice, because he was too weak to be troubled with partings, and she half believed it. The road to the village ran along the edge of the moor for the better part of 2 miles, exposed to the wind the whole way, and by the time she reached the first houses, her hands had gone numb from holding the baby close enough to keep him warm. She took a room at the inn, paid for out of the shillings in her hem, and sat on the narrow bed with Thomas against her chest, and for the first time in a great while, with no one at all to see her, she wept. Not loudly. She had never learned to weep loudly, but long and hard and alone, the way a woman weeps when she has spent every other resource but grief. At Esherton Hall, the note was found within the hour, and carried first to Mrs. Prior, who read it twice and then went, without pausing to consider the impropriety of it, directly to the estate office. Julian read the 3 lines standing at his desk, and something in his face, which had held steady through 7 years of grief, and a father's dying, and a household full of intrigue, came apart in a way Mrs. Prior had not seen it come apart before. "She thinks she's protecting us," he said, half to himself. "She thinks no such grand thing, my lord. She thinks she's a maid with no family, and no character to fall back on, and she's done what such women are taught to do, which is disappear quietly before someone else does it to them for her." He was silent a moment, the note still in his hand. "Send for the curricle. My lord." "Now, Mrs. Prior, if you please." It was Mrs. Prior, in the end, who told him more than he had asked to know, because she judged, rightly, that the time for half measures had passed. She told him what she had watched all that winter, and had never been given leave to say aloud, that the coal and the linen and the surgeon's visits, all of it traced, however carefully hidden, back to his own hand. That the maid did not know it, that she believed herself abandoned by fortune entirely, with no notion that the household's quiet mercies had a name, and that the name was his. "You've let her think herself alone in the world, Mrs." Prior said, not unkindly, but not sparing him either, when you have been at her back the whole while. "That's a strange sort of kindness, my lord, To keep so well hidden, it does the receiving heart no good at all. He did not defend himself. He only asked, low, whether she thought it too late to mend, and Mrs. Pryor, who had known him since he was a boy climbing the same back stair he had crept up that first winter night, told him that it was never too late to tell a woman the truth, only sometimes too late to be forgiven for having waited. He found Ruth at the inn an hour later, having ridden the 2 miles at a pace that left the horse blowing hard in the yard. She was sitting by the small window with Thomas asleep at last against her shoulder, and when the innkeeper's wife showed him up and she saw who stood in the doorway, she did not rise, and did not speak, only looked at him with an exhaustion too complete for surprise. "You needn't have come, sir," she said. "Whatever wages are owed, Mrs. Pryor will see to them. There's no need to trouble yourself. I haven't come about wages. Then I don't know what you've come about." He came into the small room and shut the door, and stood a moment with his hat still in his hand, as if he had not quite decided, even now, how to begin. The fire in the little grate was poor and smoking, and the room smelled of tallow and damp plaster, nothing like the great cold halls of Esherton, and it was there, in that mean little room, that he chose at last to stop concealing anything from her at all. "My name is Julian Vane," he said. "I did not lie to you in giving it, but I withheld the whole of it, and that was its own kind of lie, and I am sorry for it now more than I can easily say. I am the Marquis of Colford. I am his Grace's son. When he dies, which will not now be long, I will be the Duke of Esherton." Ruth went very still. Thomas stirred against her shoulder and settled again, and for a long moment the only sound in the room was the poor fire and the wind against the little window. "You watched me," she said finally, "that first night. You were in the doorway. I was. Why? Because I had come home meaning to see my father's face one last time, and instead I found a stranger kneeling at his bed at midnight, with no one to see her do it, giving him the one thing none of us, his own blood, had thought to give him in years. I wanted to know what sort of woman does that, with no reason to expect it will ever be known. I have met a great many people, Miss Calloway, who are very good when they believe themselves watched. I had all but stopped believing there were any who were the same when they believed themselves alone. And now you know. Now I know." He said it simply, without ornament, and something in the plainness of it undid her more than any grander speech could have. "I have watched you all winter, and arranged what small comforts I could without my name on them, because I did not want you kind to my father, or civil to me for a title's sake, or a coin's sake. I wanted, God forgive the vanity of it, to be certain of you, before I ever let you be certain of me. I see now that in doing it I let you believe yourself unloved and unwatched at the very moment you were neither, and that was cruel of me, however little I meant it as cruelty. I am sorry for that, more than for anything else I have done in my life." Ruth looked down at the sleeping child, and then back at him, and her voice, when it came, was not angry, only very tired and very honest, the way it had always been. "I don't know what to do with the Duke's son, sir. You need not do anything with him tonight. I have not come to ask you for an answer. I have come only to tell you the truth, because you deserved it a great while ago, and because I would rather you know exactly who has been standing at your back all winter, than let you go on believing you had no one." He set his hat down at last, on the little table by the window, as if setting down some other burden with it. "I will not ask you to come back to Esherton for my sake. I will ask you to come back for my father's, because he asks for you. and has asked for nothing else in a week. What you decide after that is entirely your own. She was quiet a long while, turning it over the way she turned over most things, slowly and without pretense. Outside, a cart rattled past in the lane, and somewhere below a dog barked twice and fell silent. "I'll come back for him," she said at last, "for no other reason. Don't mistake it for more than it is." "I would not dream of it," he said, and something in his tired face for just a moment came close to that rare, unpractised smile she had seen once before in the ledger room, there and then carefully put away again. The old Duke died 11 days later, on a morning grey and mild, with the window cracked to let in the smell of thawing earth, the first real thaw of the year. Ruth was there. So was Julian, seated on the other side of the bed, his hand resting, for the first time in years, over his father's. Thomas slept in his basket by the hearth, and the old man's last clear words, spoken to no one in particular, were that the fire was good and hot, an echo, unknowing, of the very thing Ruth had said to him on the first night she ever sat with him. He went quietly, without struggle, the way men go when they have, in the end, been allowed to feel loved before the end came. Ruth did not weep where anyone could see it. She held herself steady through the small necessary business of a death, the folding of hands, the drawing of the sheet, and only when she was alone in the corridor afterward did she let her shoulders shake. Briefly, silently, before she straightened them again and went to see to the child. Because grief, in her experience, was a thing you managed around your work, not instead of it. The funeral was cold and correct, and largely without warmth, the way such things generally were among people whose grief was mostly a matter of form. Lady Miriam wore excellent black and received condolences as though they were owed her personally, and made a point, twice, of remarking within Ruth's hearing that the household would want a firmer hand now that responsibility had passed properly to the family. She did not yet know how completely her nephew had already taken that responsibility in hand, nor how little patience he had left for her opinions on who did or did not belong beneath his roof. It was 3 days after the funeral, in the small parlour off the library, the one room at Esherton that had always been kept warm and plainly furnished rather than grand, that Julian asked Ruth to sit with him, and told Mrs. Pryor they were not to be disturbed. The fire was good there, and the smell was beeswax and wood smoke, nothing of sickness left in it at all. He did not sit at once. He stood by the mantel a moment, turning something over in his hands that she could not see clearly, and when he spoke it, was without any of the formality that had governed every previous conversation between them. "I have told you who I am," he said. "I have not yet told you everything I did, while you did not know it. And I think you are owed the whole of it before I ask you anything further. Go on then the coal that came to your room all winter. The linen. The surgeon's visits for Thomas, and the account sent to my office instead of to you, so you would never have cause to refuse it, because I knew you would refuse it if you were given the chance." He paused. "The order that kept you in your post, against my aunt's wishes. The week you thought yourself sent away, and went of your own accord instead. All of it was mine. I asked that none of it carry my name, because I did not want gratitude from you. I wanted only to see whether you would go on being exactly what you had been the first night I watched you, whether anyone was giving you anything or not. And did I? You did." His voice roughened on it. "Every single time. You refused a crown from Mrs. Pryor's hand without knowing whose it truly was. You refused to unsay a word of truth to my aunt, though it cost you your place. You walked 2 miles in the March cold, rather than let any of us be troubled by your staying. I have never in my life met anyone who wanted so little and gave so much, and I confess to you now, plainly, because you have never once given me anything but plain dealing, and I owe you the same. That I have loved you since the first night I stood in that doorway, and watched you feed my dying father broth you had carried warm against your own body, expecting nothing, not even to be seen. Ruth's hands, folded in her lap, did not shake. She had trained them not to, long ago, against harder things than this. You might have told me sooner, she said. I might have. I was afraid, I think, of what I would become to you the moment you knew. A title changes how people look at a man. I have been looked at that way before, by someone who found, in the end, that she preferred the title to the man attached to it. I wanted, selfishly perhaps, one more season of being only Mr. Vane to someone, before I became the Duke of Esherton to everyone, including you. And now I am asking you plainly, as myself, with no name held back and nothing left concealed. I do not ask you to answer me tonight. I will not press you, and I will not think less of a no than of a yes, if a no is what is true. I would rather have your honest refusal, freely given, than a yes you felt cornered into by gratitude or by rank. Take what time you need. I have waited a winter already. I find I do not mind waiting a season more, if it means the answer, whatever it is entirely your own. She looked at him a long moment, the fire warm on the side of her face, and found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she did not need the season he had offered her. I don't need time, she said. I've had all winter to know my own mind, whether you were telling me the truth of yourself or not. I loved the man in the ledger room before I ever knew he had a title to his name. I don't love you more for having one now, and I'll tell you plainly, I'd have loved you the same if you'd stayed nothing but Mr. Vane your whole life long. She paused, and something almost like the ghost of amusement crossed her tired face. I do have conditions, though, if it's a bargain you're making, and not only a declaration. Name them. I'll not be lied to again, not even kindly, not even to spare my feelings. If a thing is true, I'll hear it plain, whatever it costs to say. Granted, and Thomas is mine, not a ward taken in out of charity, not a poor relation kept in a corner. Mine, in every way a son can be, and no one in this house or any other is to say different. Granted 100 times over. I had hoped, in fact, he might in time think of me as something more than his aunt's husband, if you would allow it. She felt her eyes sting, finally, in the warm quiet of that small room, and did not fight it this time, because there was no one there she needed to be strong in front of. He crossed to her, slow, and knelt, and drew the glove from her right hand himself, finger by finger, with a care that made the small ordinary act feel larger than it was, and pressed his mouth once to her bare knuckles. Yes, she said. It was the only word she needed. They were married in June, quietly, in the small stone church at the edge of the village, with none of the grandeur a duke's wedding might have commanded, and all of the warmth such grandeur usually lacks. Lady Miriam did not attend. She had returned to Bath within a month of the funeral, her influence over the household quietly and completely ended, and the invitation sent to her was, by mutual and unspoken agreement, the last correspondence either Julian or Ruth troubled to send her. Mrs. Prior cried through the whole of the short ceremony, and denied it fiercely to anyone who mentioned it afterward. A year later, In the same season the story had begun, with the first mist of autumn curling low over the moor. Ruth sat by the fire in the small warm parlour off the library. Thomas asleep at last against her shoulder, grown heavier and taller in a year, but still, in sleep, small enough to fit the curve of her arm the way he always had. Julian came in from the estate office, ink still on his hands, and sat beside her, and took her bare hand in his, and did not let go of it, not for the whole of that quiet evening. The two of them watching the fire, the way two people watch a thing they have both, in their own ways kept alive. On the chair by the hearth lay the same blue wool blanket, worn soft now, with 2 years of use, folded and waiting for whichever child might need it next. It had wrapped a fatherless boy on the coldest night of a stranger's dying, and warmed a duke's failing heart when nothing else in the world could reach it, and it stayed in that room still, not because it was needed for warmth, but because some things earn their place by what they were once asked to carry. It is not the grand gestures that prove a heart. The story is remembered to have gone. In the mouths of those who told it after, it is what a person does for someone who can give nothing back. On the coldest night, when no one of consequence is there to see it done. Thank you for staying with Ruth and Julian all the way to that fireside, because a story about being kind when nobody is watching only means something if someone stays to the very end of it. If it moved you, subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next one. I would love to know in the comments, what do you think the old Duke saw in that baby's face that made him weep after 11 years of feeling nothing at all? Tell me your answer below, and I will be back very soon with another story worth staying up late for.